excited to go ahead and get started here. It is 3:30. It is a pleasure to see many of you who are willing to show us who you are. Welcome in our second of our series of our Personalized Learning Academy Phase 3 monthly webinars. We're excited that you're able to join us this afternoon for an awesome ride for the next 45 minutes to an hour with connecting to Jim from Wisconsin. He tells us the weather out there is just beautiful, and I was letting him know a bit more like the way the PA weather is today. But of course, we can't complain because we've had beautiful weather up until today, and it's even still kind of warm out there for our November weather, so it's a bit strange. But we've had a lot of sunshine recently, so we're getting some rain now for sure. But anyway, thanks so much for joining us. We just wanted to be able to recap very quickly for you this afternoon where we are and what we're doing. So currently you're in the Educator Competencies course, and we just want to remind you that we want to make sure that everybody has taken the competency self-awareness tool. Hopefully you've completed that. If you haven't, you want to be able to go in and complete that very shortly, as well as if you've not yet done the core components, we want to make sure that you finish that. The core components, many of you that were in phase 2 would have already done those. So you could have breezed by that if you've already done those in our phase 2. And then the guiding principles is what you really want to get concentrated on to be able to finish. So there's 3 guiding principles that you want to be working your way through, particularly in the course itself, because very shortly, mid-November, you will see competency 1 and all of its indicators will be unveiled. So hopefully this will give you enough time to complete the competency self-awareness, the core components, and the guiding principles, so that by mid-November, when we announce through the updates when competency 1 is available, you'll be able to start working through those indicators. And just to keep in mind of your timeline, you'll have through the months of November and December to be able to work through competency 1 through all of those indicators. And then in January 1, we'll open up competencies 2 and 3 with their corresponding indicators for you to be able to work through. So that just gives you a quick reminder of where we are and what we're doing in the course so far. In addition, many of you had selected to have your Schoology accounts converted over to an enterprise account. So we had posted a number of surveys in this course to make sure that everybody was included, to be able to let us know if you needed your account converted, so that you would be able to use the next and previous buttons when you're actually in a folder and have the next and previous buttons over here. So if you didn't get a chance to have your account converted, if you are on a basic Schoology account and need that yet to be done, please do reach out to me and I'll help you in making sure that you get that conversion. The last thing that I just want to highlight is make sure that you have the correct notifications turned on in the Educator's Competency course. So when you're in the course itself, in the upper right-hand corner, there's a notifications button, and we want to make sure that you have it checked that the course updates posted, that anytime a course update is posted, you will get an automatic email on that update. So of course, we realize not everybody's living in Schoology, so that if things are posted in Schoology, you don't miss those updates. So the updates are on the left-hand side under the updates section. So as we post out reminders of different work that's being done in the course, or other reminders about the upcoming webinars, we are posting in this updates section. So we want to make sure that you don't miss those updates, particularly when they come through, so that they get sent directly to your email. All right. So also remember that at the very bottom of this course, we are archiving the monthly webinar series. So when you click in that folder, you'll see from our October 29th first webinar that we had on the national trends with Beth Rabbit, and then today's recording and any other materials that Jim has provided for us will be in this folder for you to be able to access as well. And again, we are recording these webinars because we understand that we need flexibility in our life right now with everything we're doing and everything we're attending. but we're not recording them just to give everybody a quick free pass. Oh, I'll check out the recording. We're really encouraging everybody to show up as much as possible every month so that you can really engage in some rich conversations with the presenters that are coming in. So we thank you for your time today. Jim Rickabaugh joins us from the Institute of Personalized Learning in Wisconsin, and we'll let him tell a little bit more about that. He is one of the authors of Tapping the Power of Personalized Learning. Many of you that have joined us on phase 1 had an opportunity to see Jim and interact with Jim. And so we were so excited to talk to Jim about doing the webinar today in really looking at high quality student achievement along the way. So Jim, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you and welcome.
Thanks, Ken. Let me just move to see if I can share my screen here so we'll get started on that. That looks good. Super. Well, it's great to be here, and it is sunshiny in Wisconsin. Of course, putting it in context, in Wisconsin in November, every day that it's not snowing is a good day. So we're absolutely delighted. So I thought in the time we're spending together today, I would try to maybe address 4 sort of issues or goals. One is the sort of idea, what is a culture of high expectations and why does it matter? And then 2, why is it important for us to enlist learners in this process? So what role can learners play? 3, what are the critical factors and drivers that can create and sustain a culture of high expectations? And then 4, what do learners need from us? What do learners need from us for that to happen? So that's sort of the way I've gone at it. Hopefully we'll have maybe 10 or 15 minutes at the end for questions, but along the way, I'm going to ask you to make use of your chat box to do some processing, to do some sharing. I found that to be a really efficient way for us to be able to engage and respond in sort of real time without having to wait for someone else to respond for us. So that's where we're at. Let's get started. So this first sort of obvious question, why do we need a culture of high expectations for all students? So let me start with sort of dissecting that a little bit. So we can have high expectations for learners to which they don't necessarily respond. We can create an environment within which students lift their performance, but they're really doing it because of what we've created, not necessarily based on skills or attitudes or dispositions they've developed. So the idea of a culture is we're in this thing together. It's not just the teacher holding high expectations, but we as a community, a learning community, are committed to high expectations. So it's everybody's a part of that work. And then the second, I think, really critical element is the all. I mean, it's easy to have high expectations for high flyers. It's easy to have high expectations for students we think should be high flyers. It's a bit more difficult for those students who don't have a history of performing at high levels or may be reluctant to perform at all. So how do we get there? And obviously in the end, why do we need it? One, in the short term, because it lifts learning outcomes. In the long term, though, if we really do it right, we can change the trajectory of kids' lives, that they begin to understand what high expectations mean for themselves, not just waiting for someone else to create those conditions, but to create a set of dispositions and skills and habits that leave them or that build for them a life of high expectations that come from inside, not just from outside. Now, there are some risks associated with expectations that's maybe worthy of our thinking about. They aren't as great when it comes to overestimating the potential of learners. In fact, there's some pretty good research that when we overestimate the potential of learners, we actually can increase their outcomes. So all that, the research that goes back a few decades around Pygmalion in the classroom, this whole idea that learners respond when we think they have more potential than they see in themselves. that overestimate. Now, we can create some frustration, but there are very few long-term consequences of students feeling from us that we see more in them than they see in themselves. The danger actually comes on the other end of that, when we underestimate the potential of learners. So let's just think about that for a moment. For high flyers, what this means when we underestimate their potential, they tend not to stretch. They tend to just go along where they've been. For learners that are sort of in the middle, often their performance goes down. If we think they don't have it, they tend not to demonstrate it. And for learners who struggle, they often don't even try. But the implications are actually larger in the long term. And I'd invite you to think a little bit about your own experience, about times when you've had teachers, educators, or supervisors, bosses who believed in you and how you responded to that. And then the flip side of that, the dangers of, or the feeling you got when other people thought less of you than you knew you were capable of doing. And the danger, particularly in the second one, is that it's long lasting. Over the years, I think about the number of people I can recall having talked about an experience where they had a teacher who thought they weren't smart, or who didn't give them opportunities, or who said really cruel things to them about their performance. And it was something they carried with them throughout a lifetime. So there are implications of how we go about expectations. So, but what I would just say is the bottom line is, one, what we expect is highly associated with how much learners respond. If we're going to err, it is always better to estimate on the high side. The outcomes are always better when we estimate on the high side. All right, so I told you I wanted you to spend some time in the chat box, and here's maybe our first occasion. What I'd like you to do is think about times when you do your best work or have done your best work, particularly in a team or with a supervisor. What conditions were present when that happened? If you would just pop it up in the chat box. What was present when you do your best work? Yeah, there's some good things. The idea of knowing what's expected, having clear goals. You're in an environment where you feel comfortable or connected, respected. You've got some clarity about the topic. Ooh, I love this one. You feel trusted. That's a big one. The opportunity for feedback. All of those are really important elements of when we do our best work. And it turns out, by the way, much of what you said, heavily reflected in research. By the way, go ahead and keep posting. I'm going to move on to the next piece. We're going to come back to the chat box in a while. And occasionally I'll pop into the chat box. I may pull out a few things just as we go. So when I think about and look at what you shared, much of it falls into two categories, which happens, by the way, to be also consistent with research about motivation that leads to engagement, that leads to higher performance. We sort of think about motivation in two categories: intrinsic, that is motivation that comes from inside, and extrinsic, that is factors that are external to us, often unrelated to our work, that is calculated to influence our behavior. Intrinsic sources are things like a natural interest. It's something I'm already interested in. So when I have an opportunity to learn about it or work on it, that's something I'm already connected to. Stimulated interest.
It was terrible, was it? Oh, good. I mean,
Sounds like we have somebody's mic. Okay, we're good. Stimulated interest, by the way, can be when we ask a provocative question, or we lay out an interesting conundrum for learners to engage in, or a problem to solve. So it can be either, but the idea of learner interest is a key element. Drive to achieve or to master something. Again, it's a natural process within it. And most learners will respond if they believe it's possible to achieve or to master. In fact, when learners refuse to respond to achievement and mastery, it often is because either one, they don't believe they can achieve, or two, there's a history of experience and pain that makes it not worth their risk. The third is the idea of presence of meaning or purpose. And this doesn't have to be a big deal, can be. It may be something that the learner already values or a purpose that they hold, but it can be as simple as wanting to accomplish a goal or to work together with a team to bring a project to a successful conclusion. But there's a reason for engaging. And then the fourth is an opportunity for independence or autonomy. That is, that I can make some choices. I can frame it. There are things I can do. And I noticed in the chat box, that's something many of you, or at least some of you, have found of interest and is compelling. In fact, I have on a number of occasions just asked people to say, think back to your K-12 experience and think of a powerful experience you had that you recall to this day. Disproportionately, by the way, people talk about the opportunity to exercise autonomy, that the teacher gave them an opportunity to do what they wanted to do, something that had meaning and purpose for them, that they could do well, they were interested in. All of those factors tend to come together, but they tend to be experiences we value and remember. And on the other side of it, what is sort of the idea of extrinsic? Well, it's an opportunity for rewards, often not directly related to the work, but it's something if we complete the task as asked, we're given a reward. The most common of these, by the way, in education is grades. That for many, many students, maybe most students, they think learning is to get a grade, when in fact, grades really should be a reflection of our learning. The work we are doing is to learn, not to get a grade. But that's deeply ingrained in our system. The second is to avoid a negative consequence. I don't want my parents to be disappointed. I don't want my teacher to be disappointed. I don't want to get a bad grade. And the third is a response to important relationships. That is, someone we care about, we don't want to disappoint them. We want them to be pleased with us, but it's not related to the learning itself. Now, what's interesting about these two lists, at least from my perspective, is that while opportunity for reward, avoiding a consequence, responding to a relationship can get us started, the more we use these factors, the less learners tend to respond. They can be useful in getting learners started in learning and work, but the more we use them, the less effective they tend to become. On the flip side, intrinsic elements, the more we use them, the more powerful they become and the more learners look for them. And so both have a role, but if we want to create a culture of high expectations, high achievement, the more we can focus on intrinsic drivers, the faster we can get there. In fact, the more likely we will get there. So here's sort of a question, just think for a moment. What source of motivation do we rely on most heavily? It turns out, by the way, that our traditional schools were designed to rely heavily on extrinsic rewards. That most sanctions, most rewards in school tend to be more on the extrinsic side. If you violate the rules, where you're supposed to be, when you're supposed to be there. And the reason for that was one of the purposes of schools was to build compliant workers, people who are able to comply. Extrinsic rewards tend to be really good drivers of compliance. Ironically, from a learning perspective, intrinsic rewards are more valuable, tend to drive better outcomes, and have a longer, if you will, life cycle in terms of effectiveness. All right, So now, underlying those elements are some really important assumptions. So I want you to just think for a moment. What assumptions do we make about learners and learning when we rely on extrinsic motivation? And then maybe a parallel question, what are the likely long-term consequences for learners of this approach? All right, so I'm going to stop and again, give you a chance to think a little bit. If you would post in the chat box. So what are the assumptions? There actually are 3 questions here. What assumptions are we making about learners if we rely on extrinsic rewards? What assumptions are we making about learning? And then third, what are some likely long-term consequences for that being the case? Yeah, the whole idea of the carrot and, by the way, the stick are part of the whole idea of extrinsic. I like that one. Assuming kids need to be bribed to learn. Learn helplessness? You bet. Something we need to force people in. So think about what this means. Just think about your comments around this and the sort of implications and seriousness of that. Assuming learners are lazy. Or that's really interesting. Assuming that that's what drives them, that they really are so shallow that they wouldn't respond to anything else. Good work, really great reflections. By the way, we probably could spend the rest of the time on just this piece because it is really that important. But let me see if I can just pull it together for us a little bit. I'm taking kind of what you've had to say, and then it sort of summarize or synthesizing it because and again, this is really important. And many of you caught this right away. This idea that if we rely on extrinsic motivation, essentially what we're saying about our learners is they are either incapable or too lazy to do the work otherwise. Yet we would rarely say that, and I don't believe we really believe it. But we get caught up sometimes in that as a driver in a way that has us behaving in a way inconsistent with what we really believe if we stop to examine it. And the second part about the learning, essentially what it says, and some of you caught this, when we rely on extrinsic rewards to motivate learners, what we're saying is the learning we're asking them to do doesn't have enough value for them to choose to learn unless we somehow are manipulating them externally. Does that make sense? It's actually a really important element. And then the long-term consequences, you nailed it right away. Learned helplessness, the idea that I shouldn't see meaning and purpose in my work. I ought to just be looking for the rewards because really that's all there is. And I've learned that over time. What's remarkable, by the way, is we have a choice not to do it. That we actually can believe in our learners. That we can share with them the magic and purpose and value of learning. And that we can help them grow into learners and workers that see value and purpose, who feel valued, who feel respected, and not manipulated. That it's really an authentic thing. But it requires us to think about our relationship with and the way we engage with learners in a somewhat different way. So here's a way to sort of just think about this. I've modified the old quote a little bit. Give a child a fish and he'll eat for a day. In other words, give them a reward, give them what they need, they'll get by with us for today. But in that process, we're not necessarily building in learners the capacity to motivate themselves, for them to have high expectations for themselves. We're controlling that environment. The second part of this idea of teach a child to fish, or in other words, help them learn how to motivate themselves, how to find meaning and purpose, how to hold high expectations. And we have given them a gift that can last a lifetime. That's a choice we have. But it's part of the factors of building this sort of culture of high expectations. So how we engage learners, how we choose to motivate them, what messages we send to them are really important. So where can we start? So you say, okay, okay, I'll agree with that, but what can I do? Well, interestingly, there are at least 4 near universal motivating elements that can build internally this sort of capacity to motivate oneself and hold high expectations for one's work. The first, the idea of autonomy, and in our conversation, that most frequently goes to voice and choice. It can be more than that. It can be giving learners opportunities to structure their work, to help them think about the path they're going to take. In fact, there's some really interesting research around this by DeStefano and others talking about 3 types of autonomy. And I would encourage you to just reflect on it. The first type of autonomy is organizational. Here might be things as simple as giving students choices on where they're going to sit. It might be things like input on school rules. Other kinds of things that just in daily life, they have some opportunity to choose. Research says that kind of autonomy can build a sense of community and belonging, can make students feel more included, but it doesn't by itself increase learning outcomes, just to be clear about that. The second type of autonomy is procedural autonomy. Here, we're giving students maybe choices or voice in how they will engage in some work. So it might be they have a project, what materials are they going to use, what colors, how they're going to demonstrate, or how they're going to display their work. And that sort of autonomy can build early interest and motivation to engage in the work, but by itself doesn't drive learning outcomes. The third type is different. This is called cognitive autonomy. Here, learners are making choices about how they're going to learn, how they're going to demonstrate it, strategies they're going to use. That autonomy drives higher learning outcomes. When learners have opportunities to make choices, to have a say with the actual activity of learning, now you get outcomes on the other side that are higher. Now, having said that, all 3 types of autonomy are important. All have their role. But if we think that giving students choices about seating will improve learning, there's not research to say that would be the case. Okay? Purpose. And again, this doesn't have to be grandiose. It's just giving students or helping students see a reason or value in the work they're doing. So it could be as simple as if students are setting goals for their learning, it could be accomplishing that goal. It could be an opportunity to work with other students to create a great product. Or it could be working on an issue of importance to them. What's critical around this is to actually have the conversation with learners about why should they learn what we're asking them to learn. I don't know about your experience. I would say pretty rarely in my formal education did I have educators who stopped and we had an in-depth conversation about why we were asked to learn something. It was just assumed that that was the next chapter. It was the next thing in the sequence. And so we just got about it. And in looking back, I suspect there was a lot of potential lost because that conversation never occurred. The third, mastery, is just this idea of we all want to succeed. We want a chance to succeed. Our work, from an educator's perspective, is to position the work such that that's a possibility, that it's worth taking the risk to engage and to struggle and to learn in order to reach mastery. And then 4, connectedness. It really comes from self-determination theory. This idea that if I feel connected, if I feel respected, if I'm noticed, by the way, and that's a really critical one, I'm noticed in class, that what I have to say, people are willing to listen to. I'm not discounted. I'm not invisible. But this idea of connectedness matters a lot, especially if we're trying to create a culture of high expectations that lead to higher learning outcomes.
Jim, I can't say enough about how that reminds me of the environment that we're all living in right now with so many students who are remoting into our classrooms and have that need for connectedness.
Okay. In fact, Ken, that's a great point because there are strategies we can use with students to help build that connectedness. And that could be the sort of conversations that go from day to day that we're adding to that story of our own shared story along the way. What's our experience? What is surprising us? What's distracting us? What's depressing us? Giving students an opportunity to not just listen, but to say along the way. But you're absolutely right. If anything, of the four, that may be, well, at least among, if not the most critical right now. Because if I don't feel connected, I'm not likely to take the risk to engage in persistent, difficult work. I may not see the purpose, and autonomy isn't all that important to me if I'm not connected. So thank you. That's a really, really great point. All right, so here we go. If you would, pull up your chat box again. So I want you to just think for a little bit about what opportunities we offer to students to experience autonomy, purpose, mastery, connectedness in their learning. So autonomy might be voice and choice, right? Purpose might be a conversation or goal setting. Mastery might be positioning work, especially, and there may be strategies you're using, or connectedness. Again, I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes. If you would, in the chat box, think about your own learners and examples of where we're giving them autonomy, purpose, mastery, and connectedness. Internships are great. Community-based learning, great opportunities. Demonstrating mastery, absolutely. Oh, I like the not yet feedback versus the grade. By the way, really powerful strategy, because once we give kids grades, often they think the work is done. So giving feedback without overlaying a grade is a really important element. And it does keep that sort of connectedness and possibility of mastery alive. Feed forward, yep. Electives, yes. Work-based, absolutely. So think about, and I would encourage you just to keep thinking about examples or having conversations with colleagues about what are we doing to tap these really powerful motivating forces, and then to build them up into high expectations for achievement. So let's look at this sort of motivation expectation connection. So do we want learners to just experience high expectations for now, that is, while they're in a classroom, or are we about building it for a lifetime? Or related to that, can we create an environment that's built by high expectations? Is that what we're looking for? Or do we want to nurture high expectations within our learners? And I'll stay with that piece, because I think the gift we give to learners is when we can nurture high expectations in them. It's a great experience for them to be in a classroom where we hold high expectations and they can see in themselves that possibility. But the big gift we can give is when they begin to take responsibility for it. So in other words, so if you think about motivation, we often talk about how do we motivate kids, and that's important. But the ultimate is, how do we help learners understand how to motivate themselves? The lifetime gift is in their understanding what motivates them, what conditions do they need, how do they go about creating motivation? The same is true with high expectations. What are high expectations for me? And how do I go about performing in ways that create high expectations? By the way, you hinted at them right away out of the gate. Knowing what the expectations are, understanding the parameters of the work, being precise. All of those elements are part of the sort of internally driven high expectations that when learners bring that to the learning environment, our work, by the way, is the best. It's the best when we have learners who understand high expectations and come with that as an expectation of themselves and of the learning environment. So where does all this take us? And why is this so important as a discussion around the learner? Well, because learning is really autonomous. It's not We can't learn for learners. We can create conditions for that to happen, but the magic comes in our nurturing in them this sort of active, self-constructed, intentional process that they themselves own the learning. They're not learning because we're forcing them or because we have rewards we're about to offer them, that they see learning as having value. So what are some entry points and path options? What does that look like? Well, let me give you just a few examples. We talked about this before. Voice and choice opportunities are sort of the first step in shifting the ownership for learning from us to the learner. Because if I have a voice, I have a choice, now I have some stake in what's happening. For us as educators, this is the place where we can now begin to coach. We can begin to plant seeds about what they're capable of that may be beyond what they imagine. Learner goal setting, and this is, Hattie's done some really good work around this, but historically, we may have had sort of a broad goal for teaching a lesson, or we may have even set goals for learners. But it turns out the really high leverage, really outcome producing difference occurs when learners are setting their own goals. And they often need coaching. They need to understand what that means. They need to understand where they are. But when we can help learners set goals, we now help them begin to contribute to the culture of high expectations. And by the way, when learners set goals, they're far more likely to pursue them and persist in them than when we've set them on their behalf. The third piece is around progress monitoring. And again, traditionally, this has been the work of educators. Turns out that a really powerful thing we can do with learners is to bring them into that process so that they're also monitoring their progress. In fact, when we reach a point where learners don't say to us, how am I doing? Because they already know how they're doing, that would be a mile marker in this process. Where learners are monitoring their own progress. They're not coming to us and say, what grade am I going to get? They know where they are because they're a co-monitor in that process. And by the way, that's a really great tool for them to have in terms of developing high expectations. They're not deferring or defaulting to someone else to tell them how they're doing. We're building that skill inside. And that can extend even to assessment input. That is, so the sort of question that says, how can you show me, or how will you show me what you've learned? Now, again, they need coaching around this. They need frameworks. They may need rubrics. They may need other pieces. But when learners are part of the process of assessing their learning within some parameters, we're now in a position to be much more supportive, much more of a coach in that process than the judge and jury. That in the best sort of environment or culture of high expectations, we're all in this thing together. It's not me as the teacher setting all the parameters and laying out all the expectations. We've now created that environment together. So here's sort of maybe another sort of lens on that same thing. This is the idea of nurturing in learners a sort of academic self-efficacy. So what's that look like? Well, this is the sort of the idea where learners understand that they can control their academic outcomes by the strategies they employ. In other words, the best strategy lifts me the highest, takes me the farthest. And if I try something and it doesn't work, I need to look at the strategy rather than to default to I can't do it. So what's my strategy? Is there a better strategy I can use? The second is the type of effort they exert. It's not just doing the same thing over and over in the same way you've done it and getting the same result. The idea is sort of, is there a better way I might employ my effort to get there? In other words, should I break this down? Do I need to look at the big picture and then come back and give effort to pieces of it? But what's the best effort I can get? And then the third part is, what resources are available around me that I can bring to bear on my learning in order to help move forward? By the way, that part is really the underlying thought for when we say to learners, try 3 before me. When you say in the classroom, try 3 things before you come to me to solve your problem. That's actually this work. What's my strategy? What's the best effort? And what resources can I bring together to bear to make a difference? So, so what are the implications here around ownership and accountability? Well, we start to make that shift when learners see learning as something that benefits them, not just to please adults. And I don't mean that it's no longer relevant to them to please adults. What I'm saying is that's not the only reason they're learning. They're actually seeing some value. They're taking some ownership for what's happening. The second part is students begin to hold themselves accountable to achieve mastery. Here, by the way, that sort of shared progress monitoring can be a really good strategy for that to happen. Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, Boys Club, Girls Club have known forever how that power of having learners be part of the process of mapping their progress. And then when students are now seeking a time, they're asking us, can I try this? How about if I did it this way? Would you mind if, how about, I have this idea, could I? Here, by the way, this process is moving us now more into the role of coach than of sort of driver, judge, jury. Here, we're in this thing together. In fact, one measure of a culture of high expectations is that everybody within, or the actors within that culture, feel a shared responsibility, a shared purpose, and shared support. That's really what that looks like. So what do learners need from us in this process? What do learners need for us to bring to the table for this to happen? Here's a really critical element, and that is they need to feel trust. That is, we trust them, they trust us. How do we get that? What are the elements that actually bring to this environment or this culture a sense of trust? Well, the first is our caring, that they feel that we actually care about them. There's an old saying that goes, I don't care how much you know until I know how much you care. If you care about me, I'm going to give you more. Because when you do that, not only do I feel good about you, I feel good about me. This idea of I care enough to expect a lot of you. And by the way, that's not a bad thing to say to learners directly. I really care about you, and I know you can do more than I'm seeing here. I need to help you. Let's find a way. Confidence. This is, I believe you can succeed. This is where the overestimation, if you will, of potential comes in. That we see things in learners that we extrapolate out so that learners begin to see more in themselves than they did before. And the trust part of this really is that we want them to be more than they think they can be, and that we're committed to that happening. The commitment side shifts just a little bit. Think about this. What if we said to learners, I cannot be successful unless you are. Therefore, I'm going to push you because I want to be successful. I have a self-interest here, but believe me, I'm not leaving you behind. Because if you're not successful, I'm not successful. And by the way, I want to be successful, and I want you to be successful, and I'm committed to it. And then connectedness, we've talked actually a lot about that. That is this idea that I respect you, I see you, you're not invisible around here. What you have to say matters. I want to know what you're thinking. Because we're all in this together. We're not just a bunch of individuals sitting here, or I'm the teacher and you're all a collective group. We're in this thing together. All right, so I'm going to now stop for a moment and give you a formative assessment. So this isn't a final grade. This is just an opportunity for you to do a little formative self-assessment. I'm going to ask you 2 questions and invite you to just post in the chat box. Why is it crucial for students to hold high expectations for their learning, if you want? Or the second, what key steps can we take to nurture high expectations from within, that is from within students? So choose either question or both. Take a minute or 2 if you would, and just pop it up in the chat box. For some reason, my chat box is not coming up. But then formative assessment is really intended to inform you anyway, right? There I am. Yeah, that whole idea of what we're doing today is really investing in them for the long term. Boy, I like the idea. Failure is not to be avoided. It's more persistence in your effort. You're right. That's great. Believing in themselves matters, right? Yep. Yeah. And that is so true. Learners establish or do their best work when they're valued, when they feel like they matter, and that we feel that. Super, thank you. All right, let me move to the last couple of slides, and then I'm going to just open it up for sort of questions and reflection. So here's a universal truth, and by the way, this isn't just for personalized learning. It's not just for high expectations. Here's a general adage, something to ask yourself whenever someone says, here's a way we can improve X, Y, and Z. If we don't change the learner's experience, we will not change the learning outcome. And I say this because often what happens in education is that there's an innovation comes out that requires a lot of change for educators, but for learners, it's pretty much the same old thing. So if you want to know if something's real or it's likely to have a significant change in outcomes, ask yourself this question. How does this change the learner's experience? And is it changing it in a way that I would predict a better outcome? And why would I think that? So just universally. So in the specific context where we are, this is, how does this change the learner's experience? Well, not suddenly, over time, I'm part of a culture that includes me, that challenges me, that supports me, that gives me say. That's difference in experience. And those kinds of changes, when taken together, can change learning outcomes. So here's sort of my last sort of look at this, and that is sort of the compare contrast. The sort of traditional model of schools is the teacher's job is to have the expertise to plan everything, to decide what's going to happen, to set out the expectations, and to convey, if you will, standards and curriculum to students. Hopefully, the students are going to respond. Some will get it all, some will get some will get less than we want. But in the end, what happens is the teachers sort of judge and jury, assigns a grade, and we move on. What I'm proposing in the context of a culture of high expectations is that we are now side by side with the learner. The idea that I can't be successful unless you're successful. That together, working together, we'll make sure that you find success in the curriculum, meet the standards, whatever that might be. But in the end, we're in this together. That's the nature of how we build a culture with high expectations. All right, let me stop there. We've got about 10 minutes left. I was afraid I would run over, and I'm pleased we've got some time left, because if you have questions, I would love to take them, either if you want to unmute and ask them, or if you want to post them in the chat box. Either would be fine.
Jim, the four areas that you outlined for universal motivating elements of autonomy, purpose, mastery, and connectedness have really made me think through a lot of conversations that we've had in the last couple of weeks with districts. Has been that districts have really been reporting across the board of lower achievement more than ever before with a group of students, that group of students that's remoting in to
Yes.
the classroom. They're not sitting there in front of the teacher, but they're online with the
Yep.
teacher. And it makes me think through what are some of the strategies that teachers can use to be connected so that those students do feel connected. You said that when they don't feel connected, then there's no stake in the game, and
Right.
why do hard work if they're
Yes.
not connected? And it's more than just turning on a camera, right? It's how to get them that they feel really part of the classroom.
Yep. And a great question, Ken. And the core of that strategy, by the way, is much the same as face-to-face. But we have to think about how do we adapt that to when students aren't here fully. So the idea of how are things going, what's happened since we last met, what did you struggle with, all of those are questions that can elicit from a learner some level of connectedness. And it's information I can use in our conversation, which also implies that we need to try and find ways to have conversations with individual learners. So they're not a passive audience, that they're active participants in what's going on. And so using what we know about learners, knowing about the learner who's not likely to speak up versus the learner who's going to talk incessantly, to just sort of help monitor and modify that to create, if you will, it's still a community, but it's a community that's formed a little differently. And by the way, as adults, think about the number of Zoom experiences you've had and the ones that really worked for you versus the ones you actually tuned out and started doing other work while it was going on. It was that sense of connectedness, that it was a relevance there. There was some purpose to it. So those same factors are kind of present. So a question would be to just sort of sit and say, okay, what am I doing, or what are we doing together to build connectedness? And by the way, that's an everyday job. That's not the first time and then we move on. So it's just, how do I keep building that connectedness? The sort of, what are we doing together to understand the purpose for the work we're doing? And by the way, I'll say this, and I may get into trouble, and that's fine. I would just say that this is a time to think about depth, not breadth in terms of learning. That the more we can do to drive the learning deeper, the more we have opportunities to address those 4 issues that I talked about. That we take a little bit more time with the things that really matter. By the way, if we do that well, we can catch up with the nice to haves later on, because the learners will have the skill set and the understanding and the context to get there, versus we're going to run at the same pace we ran face to face and just hope you keep up. Does that make sense? Those are, I think, are critical elements for us to just understand that the basics are the same. How the strategies we use to put them in place are going to look a little different. Any others? I hope, by the way, this has made sense for you. This is why I told Ken and Colette earlier. This was a nice challenge for me because it forced me to go out and think about some things in a little different way in terms of how they contribute to a culture. So, yeah, the whole idea of identifying the sort of what's priority. And I don't know about your experience in Wisconsin. It feels like we're bouncing back and forth. Like 3rd grade's out for a week and a half now. Now 10th grade, now the high school is going to go remote. And that building continuity is really difficult. And I would say it's one that we need to actually spend more time on now because of that moving around. By the way, and it's, there's a double challenge if you've got sort of concurrent instruction going on where you've got kids in front of you and you've got kids on cameras off the side. Finding activities to bring those other kids in without necessarily slowing down or creating undue or untenable distraction in the classroom. Those are not small matters, and they're not easy. But if you could build it around those sort of 4 really core elements, keep asking yourself, what am I doing here to help them build autonomy within some fences, within some confines? What are we doing here to keep the purpose, the main thing, the main thing? What am I doing to make it possible for learners to be successful? And then what are we doing to continue to build connectedness and community in the end? If we get those 4 things right, we'll make it through. And I by no means mean to say that's an easy given. But keeping those 4 sort of pillars as part of the experience can help us keep moving forward. And by the way, we can also stop and ask learners what they're feeling. What are they thinking? Part of getting them to enlist, to buy into the culture, is actually being willing to be vulnerable, to say, I really want us to be successful. I feel like right now we're not. What can we do together to get past this rough spot? And the more we've built relationships and connectedness, the more likely they are to take a risk and help us do that. Well, I can echo that. I'd be happy, by the way, if there are follow-up questions, you have my contact information. Please feel free to send it along. I fervently hope that this has been useful for you today, that you can take away some ideas or some strategies or possibilities that you can implement or pass along. Keep up the good work down there. Don't let the rain get too high, and we'll get through this thing.
Jim, we thank you so much. I think that one of the things that was reiterated to me this week is metacognition is essential. And
Yes.
we need to take time to really think and reflect, get off the hamster wheel that we're on, and take some time to think. So you gave us so much to be able to think about. We just thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much for having me. It was so great to reconnect. And hopefully next time it'll be face-to-face.
We hope
Absolutely.
so.
That's right.
Okay, you guys, take care.
Perfect. Ladies and gentlemen, have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much for joining us today.